Hello, and thank you very much for joining us for the third of the Future of Human Reproduction Research Showcase series. Today, I'm joined by Kirsty and Vincent, who will be talking to us about how can a child's development be shaped before birth. This is a recorded piece of content, and we have been very thankful to all those who shared their questions with us in advance. What we're going to be doing today is hearing a little bit about each of our speakers and the research that they're doing before moving on to the questions that you've kindly shared with us. The content will be shared soon after, and this is all done with the support of the Wellcome Trust. So in a moment, we'll move on to hearing from Kirsten and Vincent. In the meantime, thanks once again. I'll see you in the questions. Over to you, Kirsty.
Thanks, Lindsay. So my name is Kirsty Dunn. I'm a lecturer in developmental psychology at Lancaster University and a co-investigator on the Future of Human Reproduction project.
My name is Vincent Reid. I'm a professor of psychology at Waikato University, and my specialist area is infant and fetal development.
Great to have you here. Thank you very much. And Vincent, did you want to start us off by telling us a little about your research?
Sure. So I'm actually a developmental psychologist, and my specialty area for over 20 years has been understanding the human infant. And so you're probably going, what? Hang on, this is supposed to be about things before birth. But what happened over the course of those decades was I realized that the methodologies that we use when looking at infants and understanding infant brain development and how that relates to other factors such as, say, sensory perception or social or cognitive processes, that those techniques and methods could also be used when trying to understand the human fetus. And so taking those technologies, taking those methods, those protocols, and then trying to understand the human fetus is sort of what I've been doing for the past, what's getting on for 10 years now. And the reality is that the work that had gone in that field in some ways was not the most robust in terms of experimental work. And so the fact that there were all these really fantastic techniques with infants was something we could bring into that domain so that we could understand what was going on. So my research started off in this area by asking about vision. So there's quite a lot that we do know about some aspects of fetal development and what goes on inside a uterus and what fetuses can and can't do and what they can and cannot process, certainly in terms of auditory processing. But vision was sort of the last frontier in many ways. Many people said you can't do this kind of research, you can't see or understand what a fetus is up to in terms of their visual systems. So we did some studies to see if we could actually explore that. And actually, myself and Kirsty did a study that was published way back in 2017, showing that you could actually shine lights in certain shapes through to a fetus, and you could modify the fetus's behaviour as a consequence of that. Would they track a particular object, a particular shape, one type of shape more than another? The answer is yes, you could. And so those are sort of classic infant paradigms that we then turned into work that you could do with fetuses. Since that time, I've moved to try and understand the role of light in the uterus. This is work that's been going on. It was first at Lancaster University and then moved through to Waikato University in New Zealand when I moved here in 2019. The reason why light in a uterus is interesting is because if you look at all the developmental textbooks, biological textbooks, it more or less says that a uterus is a dark place, and that this is a really good thing for the development of a fetus, because the emerging eye, the developing eye, is very sensitive. It turns out that that's actually just not factually accurate. So there was a model that I didn't produce, someone else called Dalguidis produced it in 2011, suggesting that actually the amount of light that gets into a uterus is far higher than we thought. That model wasn't particularly wonderful. It was actually based on shining light through deceased chicken tissue, in other words, chicken breast from a butcher's. And so that's not the same as living tissue, and it's not the same as human tissue in many ways. So some of the work we've been doing recently is creating Monte Carlo models where we actually have tissue topology information about different types of tissue, whether it is skin or adipose or muscle or the uterine wall or amniotic fluid. And then what we're doing is simulating billions of photons as they cascade into that material and how they scatter and how they get blocked, and effectively trying to work out how much light gets into a uterus. And what we find is that the amount that gets in, typically, if you have about 2 centimeters of adipose, is that it's enough for a fetus to probably have a visual experience. So there's enough light there. It's sort of like sort of a full moon or civil twilight as a nice analogy. So civil twilight is when the sun has set, but it's not yet dark. So for adults, that's good enough for us to actually read a book. So whether a fetus could do that that's an open question, because their visual system isn't as developed as ours, certainly not at that period. But what it does suggest is that fetuses are probably having a visual experience of something, even if it is just sort of light and dark, and the difference between the two. And that then leads on to all sorts of aspects of trying to understand what a fetus processes and actually how a fetus develops. So for example, if a fetus understands that moving the hand in front of the eyes is something that they have some control over, then that feeds into their motoric development, that feeds into contingent response, that feeds into a rudimentary body schema. So we're moving into sort of understanding that, if you like, the foundations of psychology of the fetus from just something as simple as, is there light in a uterus? And so that's what sort of made us want to dig into this. At the same time as doing this kind of work, we were also trying to understand, and this is work that I've been doing with Kirsty, what's going on in terms of fetal vision. And so we had a PhD student, Jess Leo, who's now at the University of Essex, and she did some very elegant studies that we're just about to publish, which really sort of outlines some of the elements of fetal vision. So just to give you an example of the sort of paradigm I'm talking about, with newborns, we know that they have a, relatively speaking, more developed peripheral visual system than foveated space. So that means that they're not very good at fixating on things or seeing things with great acuity. But if you show something to their peripheral vision, movement, then they pick it up, they detect it. And a newborn will then move and engage with that information. So they have quite a good peripheral visual system. We wanted to know, do fetuses have a similar predilection to attend to information into that space that is in the periphery? So what we did is we got some lights and we sort of moved them up and down, and we tracked the eyeball using an ultrasound and to see whether or not the eye would actually, because you can see the lens inside the echolochaic orbital socket. And so we tracked that lens on the ultrasound, whether it would shift upwards and downwards if it was following these particular movements. So we presented some of the center of the face of the fetus, or some to the side, and what we found is that we get more eye movements and more engagement for those that are in the periphery. So in other words, fetuses in the 3rd trimester already have preferential visual processing in certain parts of their visual fields. So that's really basic sort of visual science that we just didn't know, and you need to know that because these are the building blocks of, you know, really what it is to be human. And it also interfaces most likely with the sorts of environments that a fetus is engaging with, which I think ties in quite nicely to the sorts of things that we'll be talking about today. So there's a sort of an outline of the stuff that we've been up to. There you go.
Thank you. That sounds so interesting. And I am going to put a pun in there about shining a light on your research so far. I can't resist. But so interesting. And it'd be great to hear from you, Kirsty, just to dig in, I guess, a little bit deeper into what Vincent touched upon about, okay, well, we're learning this basic research, or this scientific research, and what are the implications? So, you know, if the fetus is engaging in that way, what does that mean for the environment they're in and how it influences them? Over to you, Kirsty. Tell us about your research.
Yeah, so I mean, my research has not been looking at whether fetuses are reading in the womb or not. So I've been focusing more on the auditory processing. So I began working in developmental psychology, looking at how we develop our perceptual, social, and cognitive skills, and how those three things build on each other during infancy. And then I found out about Vincent's grant, where he was beginning to look at visual development in the womb, and thought that sounds awesome. Would like to work on that. So interviewed, and thankfully got to work on the grant. So I began working with Vincent on trying to work out how we could adapt our newborn methodologies to using a prenatal sample in the womb, so that we could actually map these trajectories of development from before to after birth. In question being, can we really continue to take what we can see that babies can do at birth as evidence for genetic underpinnings, or do we have some environmental influence beforehand, and does that matter? So following on from the work that Vincent talked about, looking at visual tracking, I began to look at responses to different social sounds, responses to different speech sounds. So, for example, the newborn baby will prefer to listen to infant-directed speech over adult-directed speech. Why is that? I mean, it's very helpful for learning language, and because it's very up and it's very down, it's long, it's loud, you leave gaps between words, and it really helps with that cueing for language learning. But do they pay attention for that reason, or is it just more interesting than adult-directed speech like this? So we've been running some studies with fetuses at 34 weeks, having a look at their physiological, so the heart rate response changes. So just like any other muscle, when we use our brain and when our brain starts working differently, it requires changes in blood flow, which will change our heart rate, essentially. So having a look at that, and then our behavior, mouth movements, overall general movements in response to the different types of speech. So we are finding that 6 weeks before birth, we do have this sort of real response to the prosody of the language. So at this point, we don't yet have that preference for infant over adult-directed speech, which suggests that this is not a genetic underpinning, and there's something that's influencing our ability somewhere between 6 weeks before birth and birth. What we do show, though, is a real dramatic difference in how we respond to infant-directed speech backwards. So once that prosody of the language that they've been listening to and are familiar with changes, that's where the retention systems really are aroused. So what's really interesting for us is that what this is showing is that they're listening to the language before birth, they're processing it, and before birth they are showing a difference in how they respond to what's familiar to them, what they've learned, versus what's new. So, as Vincent talks about, this is the real building blocks to understanding what's happening in that sort of late gestation in terms of what they're listening to, what they're attending to, and how that's changing their behavior already, which means probably can't continue to take what we see at birth as definitive evidence of the genetic underpinning. So that's the work that I've been working on with Vincent, and then I was lucky enough to be involved in this Future of Human Reproduction grant, which is really quite a thinking through grant. There's no experimental work happening, which is very new for me. I get that slight itch there. Stop designing a study. Let's talk about this moment. So this project is funded by the Wellcome Trust, Future of Human Reproduction. It's an interdisciplinary group, people from design, English law, English literature, law, philosophy, bioethics, and then myself from psychology. We're sort of working to explore conceptual and ethical issues that might emerge as a result of different reproductive technologies that emerge. How different technology and how we can reproduce might change the way that society works, or the types of ethical questions we need to ask. So we've been focusing on 3 technologies. One is genome editing, so changes to DNA sequences. One is IVG, so that's the creation of sperm and egg cells from other cells, such as blood or skin cells. And then finally, and I think most relevant for this conversation today, ectogenesis. So this is the full or partial gestation of a fetus in an artificial environment, so sometimes called an artificial womb. So I think where our focus really comes in is looking at, okay, so if we're going to be gestating a fetus in an artificial womb, but we don't yet know how our environment in an actual womb is influencing development, what environment do we give a fetus in an artificial womb? That's the sort of overarching major question, I think, for us as psychologists, in a nutshell.
That's really, really helpful. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for introducing your own research, and both yours and Vincent sound so interesting, and I feel like we could have a series of webinars just on those alone. So watch this space.
Do that.
Sorry. And thank you again for the introduction to the future of human reproduction research. Certainly a lot of the questions that we've had come in advance of today's discussion were about just that, ectogenesis. And before we move on to the questions, I just wanted to just pause for a moment and just ask either of you if there's anything else you wanted to share in advance of the questions. Because as I said, we have got quite a few that it will be lovely to take a deep dive into for the remainder of the content. But is there anything messaging that you wanted to ensure that was put across to the audience, so to speak? What's the key takeaways for you so far?
Well, from my perspective, looking at the sorts of questions that we're likely to be asked, probably it will come out, in those discussions, all the sort of key takeaways. Yeah, I think Kirsty's alluded to the fact that there's an awful lot that we don't know. It's one of the reasons why I sort of moved into this space from infancy research, is just there is a huge amount that we need to understand that is just either currently assumed and is often incorrect, or we just haven't even started looking at many of these issues. And so I expect that some of these things will come to the fore when we address some of the questions.
Excellent. In that case, that's what we'll just do now. So for everybody that's listening, what we've done is we've received a number of questions from people over the last few weeks. We've been in touch over social media, we've emailed people through our networks, and really sought to connect with people who we felt might have been interested. So this is where some of the questions have been generated. If you do have further questions after listening to this webinar, please do get in touch with the Future of Human Reproduction team. I'll share our email address on the final slide today, and we'll be able to correspond with you about those. But what we've done is tried to put them into themes. So what we'll do is move through these now, and I'll pose each question to both Vincent and Kirsty, so you can nominate yourselves or put yourself forward to respond to those. The first few questions will be touching on technology and the state of play, and then we'll move on to links to current reproductive technologies before thinking about, well, does the environment matter? So to begin, technology, the state of play. First question, where are we with the research on ectogenesis? Kirsty, did you want to talk about that a little bit? Because that's where you left off with the future of human reproduction research.
Yeah. So just to really highlight before I do that, we are not the scientists looking at ectogenesis. So very much a medical field, and the updates on where they are few and far between. So I don't know that I have the most up-to-date state of play. But essentially what we have are 3 main teams across Philadelphia, Japan, and the Netherlands. And they're essentially taking 2 approaches to this. So mostly the focus is very much on partial ectogenesis rather than full ectogenesis. So in the instance where a fetus would be born too early for current intensive care units, so NICU wards, to be able to help that infant, that newborn, preterm newborn infant, this technology will sort of step in to assist before they can be born at a healthy gestational age. So in that instance, we've got 2 approaches. We've got One that focuses on essentially like ECMO, where the fetus is kind of intubated and blood flow regulated, very much like you would imagine a preterm fetus in a NICU ward now, but the breathing is being done for the preterm infant, the blood flow is being done for the preterm infant, so they're not technically doing anything on their own yet. Another is to like immerse the fetus in a fluid-filled bag, and that pressure there keeps the lungs inflated, and it means that, and this fluid is filled with a lot of oxygen, so it's very much more akin to, you know, a fetus in a fluid-filled womb. The testing has involved mostly so far lambs, so they have been able to move a fetus from a sheep's womb into these what they're calling biobags, and they've been able to gestate the fetus there, where all lambs are surviving and showing evidence of being sort of healthily developed. So this sort of thing, they plan to sort of submerge fetuses in pods, essentially. Another way of doing this, so the Netherlands group are actually, they're not working on animal research, they're actually using modeling to model what, you know, what they would get, what health treatment they would give to the fetus, and what they would do to do that. Where we're at in terms of moving from animal research or models into actual human testing is really to be debated. This is not something that will be happening tomorrow. The difficulty in moving from sheep and models to human anatomy is that, so a fetal sheep lamb is their system, they're actually larger than a human fetus, relatively speaking, and their blood vessels are much larger. So moving from working with blood vessels of a lamb to a human is more complex than it would seem. It's not just a case of, oh, we just need smaller tubes. That all needs working out first. Nonetheless, the FDA have had conversations in September 2023 to discuss the ethical issues of moving to human testing. So we are at that stage. So we are at a stage where we really, really need to begin to think about what else does this, you know, partial ectogenesis system, whatever that looks like, need in terms of the environment before we move forward for psychological development, not just health development.
And so what I'm hearing is that it's really important to be having these conversations, doing this psychological research now, because we're still quite uncertain about when this scientific research might come into play in the real world, so to speak. There's an undefined date, and I think I've in my own reading and research that, you know, some people say, oh, it could be 10 or 20 years. Some people are just like, I'm not putting a number on that. So it's very, very much unknown, but the conversations, the research about impact need to happen now. Is that right?
Well, yeah, I mean, so this is the thing. So you look at some of the predictions and maybe 10 or maybe 20 years, and that sounds like a very long time, but in the length of time it takes to run prenatal studies, to learn more about fetal development, I mean, Vincent can sort of tell you how long it can take for that to happen. There's a lot to do in that time.
And actually, Vincent, if I may, what I'd be really interested to hear from you is just a little bit about, I guess, those elements of safety and effectiveness. So in terms of building on what Kirsty's described, the current research on fetal development, what does it tell us about the safety and potential of ectogenesis? You know, can it be made as safe and as effective as possible? Can you make any comments on that?
That's a really good couple of questions, Zinzi, because what we know about fetuses ultimately is that actually there's an awful lot that we don't know. And so the issue for me there is that a lot of the work, if you look at, you know, biological textbooks, effectively says something like, in the auditory domain, the sorts of information that a fetus get is similar to the outside world, but the decibels are attenuated somewhat, so it's not as loud, and there are certain frequencies that are cut out. So a fetus therefore doesn't have an auditory environment that's the same as if you're in the outside world. much of that work is actually based on, sort of ironically, I suppose, perhaps, on work with sheep. So we're assuming that that's how things are in humans, but that work in the 50s and 60s is mostly based on literally putting microphones inside sheep back in the day. And then we're saying, well, if it's like that for sheep, it's probably like that for humans as well. It's very hard to do that kind of research with humans, because the idea of putting foreign objects, inside someone for pure research purposes is always challenging, shall we say, or questionable. So that's the auditory sort of environment in many ways. For vision, it is certainly very dark in there, but there is some light, and in some ways that's the bit that I've been exploring for the last few years. If you look at the so there is the video of a lamb that you can see that is in a partial ectogenesis situation, and there's a little video you can watch online. And what strikes me about the biobag is that actually it's clear plastic, and there you've got the lamb's eyes, effectively being able to process information in various ways. And so the question for me is, do we have are those parameters right? Are they going to work in terms of potentially having unintended consequences related to sensory development? And it's not just the auditory world, it's not just visual information processing. So the vestibular system, developing a sense of balance. Humans are not the greatest at balance when contrasted to four-legged animals. A lamb is born and they start to move around pretty quickly, and they can stand up after not too long. You obviously don't have that with humans. We take quite a while to sort of get ourselves organised in terms of motor function. But moving around and being moved around, and having that experience inside a uterus, and having contingent response as a consequence, those sorts of, you hear a noise, or you get a physical sort of bump or a shock, etc., and then you hear a voice, which is the pregnant person, those things all combine to give you a sense of sensory processes and how they interface with each other. So that sort of multimodal information that is needed to sort of integrate sensory systems, how much of that is needed? And in an ectogenesis situation, you're effectively stripping many of those things away, or not including them at all, and they may be essential for human development. So I guess where I would be coming from is, how do you make it as safe and effective as possible? You understand the contribution of those elements of the environment that actually then integrate to interface with the nervous system of the fetus, that are required for sort of optimal development. And we need those parameters before we could ever come to any definitive conclusion.
And so we're still learning about that, we're still developing that.
Absolutely. In fact, I would argue that we're actually just at the beginning, rather than to a point where we could say, yes, partial ectogenesis with humans, let's do it tomorrow. And as Kirsty pointed out, this kind of research, the work that we have done, each study takes, you're talking years rather than months. And that's just for one aspect of understanding one area of one sensory system. And yet there's a plethora of areas that have not really been explored in that way. More people need to do this research. It can't just be us. Not only that, but you need to look at all sensory systems. So there's a real need for people to work in this space.
And I'm just conscious of that, but there was quite a direct question from the audience, so forgive me, because I'm very conscious that you said there's more research that's needed. We need to be doing more in this space, but is it being considered as a viable kind of alternative piece of tech? I don't know, Kirsty, if you want to come in as well. The people that you've been working with, both of you, do they see this as a viable kind of development?
Yeah, I can speak to that a little bit. So there have been surveys that have been various different bits of research that have been done with different clinicians in terms of how they feel about the tech. And of course, it's just the only tech that's being worked on in terms of support for preterm development. So the NICU ward itself is a tech that improves the chances of preterm infants. All of the questions and all of the things that we're saying about the the work that needs to feed into ectogenesis is the sort of work that also needs to be fed into the NICU wards. So preterm babies, there will be a certain percentage of them that go on to have cognitive difficulties or delays, and we still don't know if that's because that was always going to happen, hence why they were born early, or because there is something about the environment of the NICU ward that is not creating the optimum environment at that gestational age. So, this sort of work really needs to be feeding into that, even, and a lot of it does in terms of, knowing that speech is very important. There are models there where there's not visiting hours and parents are encouraged to talk to their infant as much as possible. But, there needs to be medical interventions. People may have other children, they may have less ability to do that. And there's still 5 times speech in a preterm ward around a preterm infant than what they would be experiencing in the womb. So you can see how that may already create difficulties and differences in the auditory and speech environment. So yes, this has been seen as a viable option. Where the healthcare professionals disagree so much is at what point it would be a viable option. And at what point, so at the moment between 22 to 24 weeks, 24 weeks, most clinicians agree that some sort of medical intervention would be viable. That said, because of different technological advances in intubation and things like that can work with those very delicate lungs, which is where most of the issues happen at that point, actually about 50% of preterm infants are viable from the 22nd week. So there are difficulties in terms of where clinicians feel that it should be viable from, but that whether yes or no, whether it's a viable option or not, in overall.
So there's it could, but then there's the should element as well. And if I may, I'm just going to take a liberty, if I may, and just skip forward slightly, because it feels like some of the questions that have come from the audience around the environment would be useful to address now before going backwards slightly in terms of the flow. Because we also had some questions from the audience about, does the environment matter? And that's what we've kind of just started to talk about in further detail. And I'm going to put some of the questions out there, so you both have heard them. Some of them are about, do babies prefer music? So speaking to the audio research, and do they prefer music that they frequently hear in the womb? And do you know if this expects the extended the preferences in later life? So there's that question there to put a pin in. Another question about factors such as how does sleep affect fetal development? Is there any data on that? And if night shift work has an impact? I'll leave those 2 questions there for you now, and then there's 2 more questions about the environment that we've had from the group as well. So I don't know if either of you want to take music or sleep.
You want to do music, Kirsty, and I'll do sleep. What do you think?
Yeah, sure. Music. So yeah, it's really, really difficult. So we are learning from the sounds in the womb, and we do prefer the things that we've been hearing before birth. So newborn babies and fetuses prefer familiarity. There are studies that show that babies up to 4 months neurologically are processing differently and preferring nursery rhymes that they've been hearing in the womb. How long it lasts in terms of a preference is really difficult to tell. Firstly, because there's so little research done on it. There is no study that I can have come across that looks at preferences from what they've been hearing in the womb to, as an adult. Because and equally what plays into that as well will be infant amnesia. So our earliest memories are usually sort of 3.5 years of age, something like that. So, and also at 4 months, our systems shift to preferring things that are novel to us. So preference versus familiarity can be very difficult to assess the difference between, just because, so we begin to prefer things that we're going to learn things from. So it's actually quite difficult to measure. Anecdotally, people do report, children preferring types of music that they've been listening to in the womb, but they've probably also been listening to it throughout infancy as well. So if dad really likes AC/DC, they're probably going to be hearing it in the room and outside the room. So it'd be difficult to know if it's because it was heard prenatally. But we certainly do learn it. We certainly do prefer preference to, and we certainly do show that preference after birth. How long that preference lasts for is very difficult to tell. I know from my anecdotal reports that I apparently really loved catchphrase. So that'll be that familiar music. Anyway, so, yeah, difficult to tell. It is something that so different music and different genres is something that I've been playing with a little bit myself in terms of processing in the womb. So I worked with the ISS team, so the IT team at the university, to create a VR environment where we filtered the music to what is best known to sound like in the womb for a music festival. So we could play different music festival songs and people could hear what that might sound like to their unborn child if they were to attend. So yeah, that was really interesting. People really enjoyed that sort of thing. So we're trying to work on that a little bit, but yeah, very little is known essentially.
Thank you, Kirsty. And Vincent, what about the sleep effect?
Sleep.
If we're going to be going to a festival, do we need to stay awake for all of it, do an all-nighter, or can we get away with some cat naps?
What a good question. So first you asked the question, does the environment matter? And I would say absolutely yes, it does. I come from a viewpoint that's known as neuroconstructivism, which effectively means that the way that I understand how the brain develops is because through various behaviors, an individual actually seeks out information in the environment that then enriches and rewards the brain and actually makes the brain develop in a certain way. So that's a theoretical disposition that's driven by data. It's driven by our understanding of actually how things work. So it's not as if everything about being a human is encoded in our genes, that there's too much stuff that's needed for a person to be sort of fully versant in all aspects of humanity if it was just in the genes. Effectively, genes have outsourced to the environment key aspects that are required for development. And so what that means is that then the environment then shapes how the brain searches out new information that then shapes the brain. So this neuroconstructivist position is something that's very much afforded in the work that we do, and there's just so much evidence for it across the board in developmental psychology. So does the environment matter? Certainly does. To talk about sleep, how does sleep affect fetal development was the question, and I'm assuming that the sleep that's being asked about here is actually sleep of the pregnant person. So rather than sleep of the fetus. So both are really important, actually. So fetuses are masters at being asleep. That's kind of how they typically are. And throughout life, newborns sleep less than fetuses, and toddlers sleep less than newborns, and through to when you sort of get decrepit and you're in your 80s and you hardly sleep at all. So there is actually a linear trajectory there. But in terms of sleep, maternal sleep and the sleep of the pregnant person, so the sorts of data that we have are mostly driven by extremes. So you can't do experiments on this kind of stuff, and so you have to rely on what are often referred to as natural experiments. So when you've got people who are really unable to sleep for whatever reason, or have excessive insomnia, then what does this do? And this is where it hits sort of methodological issues, because what that means is that there could be multiple sort of causal reasons for why there are impacts on fetal development. So someone who is very, very depressed, for example, more likely to have low birth weight newborns. And this may be because a very depressed person is not going to look after themselves and will not eat a balanced diet. And that will then have flow-on effects also related to the fetus. So the depression actually then leads on to something else, if you like. So you can't say the depression is the thing that causes, and you can't say that sleep dysregulation is the thing that causes, because then there are cascading elements of different pathways that could lead to that set of outcomes. Mm-hmm. So does sleep affect fetal development, the short answer is yes, but based on data where you have extremes of behaviour. And so in the sort of the more normal range, there isn't so much evidence. You know, it's got to be the extremes, and that's the information that we have, just based on the fact that you can't do an experiment where you force people to be awake. That's a no from any ethical board that I've encountered. So to then ask you sort of asked another question, didn't you? So it was to do with data on, or the impact of night shift work on.
Exactly. Yeah.
And here there is evidence, and again it's at the extremes. So night shift, if you're pregnant and you are a night shift worker, then you have there is a raised risk of miscarriage. So that doesn't just affect sleep, you know, and in terms of the, you know, fetal behaviour, etc. But so messing around with your circadian rhythm in extreme ways, such as night shifts, then can have, you know, quite significant effects in terms of you know, carrying a child. So you know, so there is evidence there for the impacts of those sorts of changes. So there are correlations with there is an increased risk for miscarriage amongst that populace in terms of working overnight shifts for a sustained period of time. But again, I mean, that's when we're talking about this, I'm not talking that, you know, it's really a major risk factor. It is a risk factor. It's, you know, incremental. And again, when you put it into a wider context in terms of elements such as, say, socioeconomic status, income, all those sorts of things, then it attenuates somewhat. So you can actually, you know, look at work that shows from a sort of health economics point of view, those people that tend to work sort of overnight in a factory, chances are they're not the in Britain what you might call sort of upper middle class types, you know, and so then that has flow-on effects for things as such as even, you know, nutritional differences that are encountered, and the ability to actually rest, take breaks, sit down, all those sorts of things that you might have in other sorts of professions. So it's not as clear cut, but there are relationships there.
Thank you. And I'm just conscious of time, but just to revert back. So what I'm hearing is that the fetus's environment matters, the environment of the carriers matters, and just touching on what you just were talking to, what you were attentive of there is that the night shift work in extremes, you know, it would be a factor to consider. But there are also other kind of contextual factors to consider as well. So I bring it up because one of the other questions that came in was to do with like parental mobility, like how does tech usage have an impact? And there's an element that I just wonder if a couple of you could comment on just briefly, because I am conscious of time, is this aspect of how does engaging in nature shape a child's development? Is there any research on that? And is there anything you can talk to on that point just briefly?
Do you want to take that, Vincent? You're quite...
Yeah, I can take it.
Sure.
So the fact that parental mobility, I'm not aware of any work in this particular space, technology usage, other than mobility related to sitting at a desk all day, as I have done. You know, so that again, it's you know, quite significant. But then that ties on to things such as your general physical health and well-being, and you know, your body weight and those sorts of things. So you're moving into that direction in terms of, you know, sort of the sorts of knowledge that we have. Engagement with nature. So the only links there are ones related to the fact that, you know, there is work showing that it's quite trendy to talk about things like you go into a forest and have a forest bath. I'm not sure if you've heard this. It's a thing that you know, people talk about these days. But what that research shows is actually if you engage with nature and sort of go ahead and listen to the ocean, so apparently listening to ocean waves is better than a forest, and a forest is better than concrete. What it does is it actually it helps to regulate your sort of your heart rate. It calms you down, makes you perhaps a bit more zen, or these days you'd say mindful. So it's all of those things, you know, are going to actually help in terms of pregnancy in general. But in terms of the flow and effects for the development, it's just, is everything in the typical range? Is everything going, according to plan? And that's all the work that there is. There isn't anything that is, more focused than that.
Thank you. Kirsty?
Yeah, so great on the nature. I won't add to that, but in terms of the social mobility and tech, I think that this tech would likely, we've had lots of conversations about this across the grant team, would likely fall into the same societal issues track as any other technology. We already know that there are differences in access to quality of care across different socio-economic status. We've got the whole north-south divide in terms of the north of England versus the south of England. We've got, developed and developing countries and access to that. And what we may well quite easily find ourselves in is a situation of access to better survival rates that are even more exaggerated than are currently exaggerated in, both within the UK and across the world.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. And one more kind of direct question, which I understand that there is a research on, but it would be interesting to know what your opinion is on low-level alcohol use in pregnancy, because that's another direct question that's come through. Given the mixed research on whether consuming 7 units or less per week is harmful, neutral, or even beneficial for the baby. So do either of you have an opinion you wish to share in response to that?
Very different question, isn't it?
It certainly is. And in fact, to the point where, so I've always taught sort of undergraduate developmental psychology, at some, every year for the last, few decades. This is a question that people are always worried about, which, makes sense. It's one that is a, very significant issue. And so what I do is actually sometimes in the lectures, I start off by saying, so this year, this is the advice. And then I actually show them how the advice has changed from, don't even think about alcohol, you evil person, to, have a bottle of wine a night, no problem, and it's actually, seriously, over the last sort of 25 years, it's vacillated between the two in terms of, current guidelines, current best thinking, best practice. My position is I don't really know, because there's just too much variation in all of the underpinning research that sort of points towards whether that's a good or a bad thing. And in terms of the 7 units or at least per week, I couldn't say. I would, and I mean, again, it's the research on the extremes, and the problem is that, a lot of it is about binge drinking. So there's significant evidence that fetal alcohol syndrome occurs because you could just even have one episode of, effectively ingesting a huge amount of ethanol, and that will produce, fetal alcohol syndrome. Whereas you've not consumed any alcohol at all throughout the whole of pregnancy. So there's an element of dosage, extreme dosage, that comes to the fore as well. And so I would imagine that having, say, a glass of wine a week is not going to be the end of the world. And if it is, then my kids are all in trouble, aren't they?
Okay, Kirsty, and anything to add on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think, I would say the same. I think it's the same as all of the other aspects. And I think, why this is so important is that we just don't know. We don't have enough longitudinal evidence. I'm part of another grant funded by the Nuffield Foundation, where we are trying to gather together all of the longitudinal evidence we possibly have between prenatal factors and later development. And there's just so little of it out there to really be able to say definitively, what the long-term consequences are. We know there are very short-term consequences in terms of behavior of the fetus, movement of the fetus, central nervous system of the fetus in utero, that actually those differences even out later on in that very low-level drinking. So for me, I think it's a very personal decision for families based on, at the moment, based on, not having enough evidence.
Thank you very much. We have a few minutes remaining, and so what I wanted to do was just ask if there was anything from you both that you think it's really important that we do now, as people in general public, i.e. people like me, or academics or researchers, funders, regulators. What is it that you think it's important for us to do now? Are there some key things that you wanted to just pull out from your thoughts, your research, and from the conversation we've had today so far?
Kirsty, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I can do it. I think for me, I think for developmental psychologists, I think it's getting involved more in answering these questions about, as Vincent said, we can't, we need lots of teams doing this to be able to answer lots of questions at the same time. For funders, really thinking about the importance of funding this with upcoming technologies where this is really going to come to the forefront, if not thinking about those current NICU wards where outcomes are not always optimum for every infant. For those looking at this sort of science, I would say to engage more with developmental psychologists and make this more interdisciplinary. At the moment, all of the focus seems to be very much on the medical outcomes for the infant and not necessarily the perceptual or cognitive development of the fetus. And I think that could be really an opportunity missed to get this involved in the development of this now. So yeah, that's what I would say. I'll pass over to Vincent.
From my perspective, we need to understand the parameters of what a fetus requires in order to have the optimal chance for development. And we're not even there yet. So at this point in time, take an example, light. Overexposure, too much light. How much is too much? We don't know. And equally, too little. So, there's evidence that actually, from mice, admittedly, and then, from looking at people who live in the Arctic Circle with no light at all for much of the year, that this can affect vision of children as they get older, and as a function of their time in the uterus. So, in other words, from those sorts of extremes, clearly we need to know how much is overexposure, how much lack, what's the amount that's needed that's actually optimal, and those optimal parameters are unknown across all sensory systems, which then have flow-on effects for, as Kirsty said, not just for the fetus, but actually these are lifelong sorts of issues that we need that they may have impacts. So I suppose my message there would be that it's crucial for policymakers and also for regulators to know this information. So ultimately that means that funders need to be able to, back this kind of research before you have a whole series of technologies such as partial ectogenesis that in some ways sort of supersede that. We don't want to have a whole generation of individuals from partial ectogenesis that actually, all of them, are only partially sighted, when that could have been avoided, for example. If the work had been done in the correct sort of parameters.
So that really, let's keep focused on and learning more about, well, to this question actually, how can a child's development be shaped before birth? So there is that research need as much as there is a real need for consideration of, well, what happens to the tech, who has equity, who has access to it after us as well. And that's another aspect that would be interesting to dig into another time, because I know we had interest in that as well. Perhaps we can invite you both back to have a conversation about all the techs here, theoretically speaking. How do we ensure equity and access to that as well? Any other final thoughts or comments in terms of what we've been talking about today and what you would like the world to hear or be asking of you before we close and with thanks?
Not from me, Vincent. I feel like, yeah.
Well, I think that one point I think that's important to emphasise, Kirsty's made it, but actually the implications for partial ectogenesis are actually also true for in NICU. I say NICU. What do you call them, Kirsty?
NICU wards? I don't,
NICU
but
wards.
yeah, NICU.
Yeah. Anyway, those, right? So the reality is that actually that many of the parameters of understanding the uterus and understanding the uterine environment and implementing them in those wards could be as equally beneficial. And so actually policy related to those also needs to be thought about and addressed in the same domain. So it's the same set of issues effectively. So it goes beyond those sort of new technologies, but actually it's the technologies that are being used now that we need to think about. And those sorts of situations that are actually, you have in, many hospitals around the world. Those aspects really need to be sort of focused on, and policy needs to be driven based on, data, and that data is often a bit absent.
That's a really interesting thing to hear. So what can we learn from today's technologies that can help us make informed decisions about future ones is just as important about speculating about what could be the future of human reproduction.
You said it so much better than I did, but yeah.
That's just luck. But thank you both very much. It was really great to hear your thoughts about this really interesting and important topic. Before we kind of close off our conversation for today, I just wanted to say thank you to you both for spending this time together with me as part of the Future of Human Reproduction Research Showcase that we've been doing at the early part of 2025. I found it fascinating, and I'm sure other people that listen to this recorded content will do as well. And I just wanted to say again, thank you very much to the Wellcome Trust, who supported the Future of Human Reproduction programme. And thanks again to all of the audience members who submitted their questions in advance of this recording. We will be in touch. Thank you again, and we'll see you for the next instalment, which will take place in May. Thank you.